A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICAN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. We will start the day with the first topic of the day, which is related to the Afghanistan peace process. The entire Afghanistan peace process we have already understood clearly and discussed it holistically in the previous ICAN videos, so you can go back and watch them. So the reason I'm picking up this topic here again is because there is a very important development that has happened now, which is the Intra-Afghan talks. So before we have seen that there was talk between the United States and the Taliban regarding the peace deal, and there was also talks between the United States and the Afghanistan government. So now what is happening is the intra-Afghan talks that is happening between the Taliban on the one hand and the Afghanistan government and the Afghanistan civil society on the other hand. And this intra-Afghan talks are taking place in Doha, Qatar. So we are going to see some issues related to this process, peace process, and what has been India's stand on this. So the major issue has been that the demands of the Taliban and the Afghanistan government have always been very contradictory. For instance, the government is demanding that first the Taliban should agree for a ceasefire. That is, it should stop carrying out any violent activities in the region, and only then any talks can happen with the Taliban. Taliban, on the other hand, is saying that a ceasefire will happen eventually, but now all the prisoners will have to be released first. So this is a contrasting demand on both the sides. While government is saying that first ceasefire and then talks, but Taliban is saying first release the prisoners and other conditions that the Taliban has put, and then ceasefire can come. So even when the talks earlier were being held between US and Taliban related to ceasefire and the suspension of violent activities by Taliban was carrying out some attacks in Afghanistan. Even while the peace deal was being struck between the United States and Taliban, there were attacks carried out by Taliban in Afghanistan. So this shows the irony of the entire process. The other issue related to Taliban is that the Taliban current team, which is in Doha to negotiate the deal with the Afghanistan government, is an all-male team. And also the Taliban has very narrow views related to minorities and women. So the government team consists of 4 women. So it is to be seen, it is one concern that how Taliban team, which is an all-male team and has narrow views on women, minorities, etc., is going to negotiate with the government team that has 4 women members. So this is one thing, and the second thing is this contrasting thing that government wants ceasefire first and then talks, but Taliban wants other conditionalities to be met by the government, and only then ceasefire will be possible. So in all this, what is suffering is the peace process in Afghanistan. The reconciliation of the Afghanistan and the civilians of Afghanistan are the ones who are suffering the most. So in this case, what stand of India? When we talk of India's stand on the Afghan peace process, India has maintained 2 things always and very constantly. India has maintained 2 things. One is that the talks with the Taliban cannot happen until and unless it gives up all the violence and all its violent activities and attacks. So what India feels is Taliban is a terrorist organization and no talks can happen with a terrorist organization. Once and when Taliban becomes a part of the Afghanistan government, India will continue to have talks with the Afghanistan government, of which Taliban will be an integral part. But Taliban per se is a terrorist organization and India is not going to have talks with terrorist organization. This has been India's traditional stand. The second important thing that India has consistently maintained is that India supports an Afghan peace process that is Afghan owned and Afghan led. So this is something, these are the 2 things that India has consistently supported. But however, because of the increasing role that the Taliban is now playing in Afghanistan, the increasing number of territories in Afghanistan which are under the Taliban control, and now Taliban holding talks with the United States and now with the Afghanistan government itself, India has also kind of trying to transition its stand with respect to Afghanistan peace process. So recently this intra-Afghan talks that are happening in Doha, that was inaugurated virtually, and our External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar was part of that video conferencing through which this Doha talks were inaugurated. So this shows how India is trying to involve itself, because Afghanistan is going to be a stakeholder even in the future of Afghanistan, and India should somehow get along and also be able to have a say in the region. But however, the External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has said that these talks between Taliban and the Afghanistan government are welcome if we want an Afghan-led and an Afghan-owned peace process in Afghanistan. But the minister has also said that in the long run, the ultimate outcome must be in sync with the democratic principles. So that is, even when Taliban is being included in the talks for formation of a government, that should not dilute principles of democracy, and that should not come at the cost of diluting the rights of the minorities and diluting the rights of women. So all of these things must be preserved even when Taliban becomes a part of the Afghan government, and the Afghan peace process or reconciliation process must be Afghan-led and Afghan-owned. So this is India's stand. And to know this, it is very important because in the exam, whatever is happening in any country, that will how it is impacting India and what is India's stand on that is only going to be asked, because something to do with India should be there. So what does India stand with respect to all these developments is very important, and you must know this. Now we'll move on to the next topic. The next topic is related to urban employment. So this can be a part of your GS2 or your GS1 also, that talks about the Indian society or urbanization and all that. So urban employment can come in either of these two papers. So what this whole article was arguing is that it talks about a concept that is called as vulnerable employment. So what is this vulnerable employment? What can we do to overcome this? So this was a focal point of this entire editorial. So now let's discuss this. So what this article is saying is that because of the pandemic and even before that, economy was already contracting. The unemployment rate has been increasing. Many of the people have been losing their jobs, and those who had jobs in the urban areas also had very poor conditions of work, and they did not have any job security. They basically were under what is called as vulnerable employment. So let us see, first thing it talks about is that the sectors these days, various sectors in the economy are shrinking. So recently we saw a lot of data related to how much percentage each sector is shrinking. For example, construction has shrunk by 50%, trade, hotels and other services has shrunk by 47%, manufacturing has shrunk by 39%, mining has shrunk by 23%. So this data indicates that the economy itself is shrinking. The most important sectors of the economy that were actually the producers of a lot of jobs, they are only shrinking. Because of the shrinking sectors of the economy, the possibility that we may be able to generate more jobs out of these sectors is very less. So because of this, what is also happening is a tendency of reverse migration, where people who had migrated to urban areas from rural areas in search of better employment opportunities are now going back to rural areas because they have lost their livelihoods in the urban areas, and it has become very difficult for them to live in the urban areas. So they are going back to their rural homes. So under all these conditions, the topic of vulnerable employment becomes very important. The article then describes what exactly this vulnerable employment is. So first is their earnings. Their earnings are very, very poor. So they are not up to the mark, definitely not up to the number of hours of work these people end up doing in a day. So in respect to that, the earnings that they get is very low. Next is productivity. So these are those kinds of employment in which per labor productivity is also very low. Next is the conditions of work. The working conditions of these laborers are also very poor, where hardly there is any occupational safety standards, and the workers are working in hazardous working conditions. That is one, without any illumination, without any lighting and ventilation. So this is a working condition, and they also work continuously for a long number of hours. Next is the rights of the laborers. The workers also are not aware about their rights, and their rights are not even being protected or recognized by the employers. This is one. Next is the representation. So how much these workers are represented through trade unions, that again is very meager. They do not have trade unions to represent them and bargain on their behalf to protect their own rights. So that representation, so that their voice can be heard by the employers, heard by the government, and some measures for their welfare can be taken, that is also very poor, because they are poorly represented through trade unions. So these are the various characteristics of vulnerable employment, and the majority of the urban employment comes under this category of vulnerable employment. Also, what it says is, whenever a person is employed in this category of vulnerable employment, the person is earning so less that the person is earning even less than 198 rupees per day. So this 198 rupees per day is actually the poverty level. And so if a person is earning, in spite of working, the person is earning less than 198 rupees per day, then that person is called as the working poor. So India like that has a large number of working poor who are though working but are still poor. Why? Because they are engaged in what is called as vulnerable employment. So data from the International Labour Organization says that out of the 535 million labor force in India in the year 2019, nearly 398 million have poor quality jobs. So this shows that a huge proportion of those employed in India actually come under the vulnerable employment, and they are probably working poor. So therefore we need to generate more jobs in the urban areas, and we also need to improve the quality of these jobs. That is why when we talk of policy interventions to protect the urban jobs and to create more quality urban jobs, we need policy interventions at two levels. One is that we need to generate more jobs, and second, we also need policy interventions to reduce the vulnerabilities which are there in the already existing jobs. That means even the directive principles, they direct the state to provide, to improve the living conditions of the workers, to provide decent wage for them. So all of these are the basic things which need to be ensured. So policy interventions are needed at two levels. One is to generate more number of jobs, and the other is to reduce the vulnerabilities of the jobs and provide labor with more safety and security of job, that is job security, and also a decent conditions of working. So these are the two levels at which policy intervention is needed. Finally, the article talks about what are the steps that can be taken, that is what is a way forward if you're going to if we aim to reduce the vulnerable employment. So mainly it talks about three important things. The first step needed is coordination. So there needs to be coordination between with the local governments, and also there will be some local entrepreneurs who can generate more jobs. There will be local community groups. There needs to be cooperation and coordination among all of this, because it is a local government which knows what is a local demand and how the jobs could be generated. So they can collaborate and coordinate with the local entrepreneurs and community groups in order to be able to generate more jobs which are also not vulnerable, but rather they are good quality jobs. So this is one thing, is that coordination is required at the local level to be able to generate jobs based on the local demands. Second is to promote the MSMEs. So we know that the small, micro and medium industries are we even in the ICANN previous videos we saw a good amount of data related to what is their contribution in the GDP and how much employment they are able to generate. So most of the manufacturing sector that is absorbing the most amount of the laborers or the workers in India is the MSMEs. So MSMEs need to be promoted, and through this a lot of quality jobs can be generated. The third it talks about is the urban infrastructure. Urban infrastructure definitely in India it needs to be improved. There are a lot of infrastructural bottlenecks in the urban areas in India. So why not use these laborers and workers to give an impetus to the urban infrastructure? So be it the healthcare services in the urban areas, for which this labor can be used to build up and revamp the health infrastructure, or be it the education infrastructure, the municipal, the water infrastructure, the sewerage, and all of these things could be built with the help of these laborers. Even affordable housing. So for many of these people who are in this vulnerable employment, affordable housing has been one of the major issues. So why not use these workers to so that they can build affordable houses and allot those houses to the same people. So by that we will also be building up the urban infrastructure. At the same time, we'll also be generating a lot of jobs in the urban economy. So these were some of the steps that this article has suggested on how to generate more jobs in the urban areas, at the same time reduce the vulnerable employment. Now we'll move on to the next topic. The next topic is the Arab-Israel conflict. So this can be a part of your GS1 syllabus because the Arab-Israel peace deal is in news, and in fact the United Arab Emirates has already normalized its ties with Israel. So this topic is very much in news this year, and in your world history section of GS1 paper you may expect a question on the Arab-Israel conflict and how it is evolving in the current times. So you must know the origin of the conflict, how Israel was promised a Jewish land in the Middle East by the Britain, US, etc., and how because of that the Arabs' rights were compromised in the region. So from then on, how countries started to build diplomatic ties with Israel, and the wars that took place in between, the Camp Davis Accord, the Oslo Accord, all of these things, the historical Arab-Israel conflict, you must know it thoroughly. And also how it is evolving in the current context, you must also know, because that is very much in news, and this makes even the previous conflict, the Arab-Israel conflict, also very important from the exam point of view. So now let us see how this Arab-Israel conflict is evolving in the current times, where this conflict is now kind of turning into some kind of a friendship between the Arab world and the Israel. So Egypt was the first country that established full diplomatic relations with Israel in 1979 itself. After that, the next country to establish peace with Israel was Jordan, and Jordan took 15 years after Egypt established its relations to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. After that, now UAE recently signed a deal with Israel, which is called as the Abraham Accord. So even in this accord, UAE has normalized its relations with Israel, and it has diplomatically recognized Israel and is establishing diplomatic relations with Israel. So this between Jordan and UAE, 26 years had lapsed. But now, after the UAE-Israel deal, even Bahrain has announced that it is going to establish diplomatic relations with Israel and is going to normalize its ties with Israel. So apart from this, there are also speculations that even more number of Arab countries, including Sudan, Oman, Morocco, which are also, some of them are part of Africa, are also going to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. So related to this, there are speculations, which means that more and more of these Arab countries are coming forward and they are trying to normalize their ties with Israel. So this is very contrary, in contradiction to the Arab-Israel conflict, which always saw each other as the enemies. In the last time where we discussed this topic as part of ICANN, we also saw a few reasons why this could be happening. So one, we saw that the Arabs want to come closer to Israel because Arabs are against the Iranian power increasing in the region. So they want to counter Iran, and that is one reason why the Arabs are coming closer to Israel. The second reason is that most of these Arab countries are the oil-based economies, and they know that this oil-based economies cannot sustain forever and ever, and oil after all is an exhaustible resource, and therefore their economies will have to diversify and establish better relations with various countries in the neighborhood. So this is another reason why the Arab countries are warming up to Israel. So we saw such other reasons as well in that particular analysis where we discussed this topic before in ICANN, as to why these Arabs and the Israel are coming closer in their ties. So in this context, let us understand what is Arab Peace Initiative and how this Arab Peace Initiative is now being violated by various Arab countries who are coming closer to Israel and trying to establish diplomatic relations. The Arab Peace Initiative was started by Saudi Arabia in 2002. So it basically stood on two principles. One is normalization and the other is withdrawal. That is, what Saudi Arabia proposed through the Arab Peace Initiative is that all the Arab countries are going to normalize their relations with Israel. That is, they are going to establish diplomatic relations with Israel, and in return, Israel is going to withdraw from all the territories that it had annexed after the 1967 war, which includes the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. So all of these where the Israel has had its settlements and it has occupied these territories, Israel is going to withdraw from all of these occupations that Israel did after the 1967 war. So in return for the withdrawal by Israel, the Arab countries are going to normalize their ties with Israel. So this was a proposal under the Arab Peace Initiative, which was proposed by Saudi Arabia in 2002. But however, what the recent agreements, if you see, they seem to contradict and violate the Arab Peace Initiative. Because if you see the Abraham Accords means the recent UAE-Israel deal that happened, where both were normalizing the ties with each other. So in that, the document or the agreement says that Israel will have to temporarily halt its expansion in the West Bank. That's all. It doesn't talk about the permanent withdrawal of Israel from all the territories that it occupied post the 1967 war. It just talks that Israel has to temporarily halt its annexation. That's all. And when we talk of the more recent Bahrain deal, or the Bahrain is trying to again establish diplomatic relations with Israel, there is no mention of any Palestinian land at all. So all of this indicate that this initiative, the Arab Peace Initiative of Saudi Arabia, is being violated, and also the rights of the Palestinian people and the sovereignty or the fight for sovereignty of the Palestinians has now been completely diluted, with several Arab countries now warming up with Israel. So this is the latest development in the evolution of the Arab-Israel relations. So this is very important, and whenever even you are writing as part of your world history where you're talking about the Arab-Israel conflict, you will have to end it with the most recent developments where this conflict is now transforming into friendly relations between the Arab countries and Israel because of other evolving dynamic relations in the neighborhood. So that is how you have to include the current and latest element also. Now we'll move on to the next topic. The next topic is life on Venus, though I don't see how it can be asked in your mains exam, but it is very relevant for your prelims, at least those who are preparing for 2021. So on Venus, scientists have discovered what is called as a phosphine gas. So why is this very important? First of all, this discovery has created a lot of excitement across the world because the scientists now say that there is a possibility of life on Venus because of the presence of phosphine gas. So what is phosphine gas? Phosphine gas is something that is produced through a biological process. It is not a chemical that can be produced using a naturally occurring chemical process. It is something that is always biologically produced. It is rather that gas which is produced by bacteria. When the bacteria, there are those set of bacteria or microbes which can live in the absence of oxygen. So it is these kind of bacteria that through their biological process produce the phosphine gas. So therefore scientists are saying that there is a possibility of life on Venus because of the presence of phosphine gas, which can only be produced by these kinds of microbes which live in the absence of oxygen. So it is possible that some of these bacteria may have existed on Venus, and because of which today we are finding traces of phosphine gas. And also phosphine gas is generated even in the volcanoes and even in the meteors. But however, the concentration of phosphine gas found in those volcanoes or meteors is very, very small, but the phosphine gas concentrations that have now been found by the scientists on Venus is very huge. In fact, the concentrations discovered by the scientists are up to 20 parts per billion, which is millions of times more than what is otherwise expected to be found if it was only because of volcanoes or meteors. So this is a very huge concentration, and scientists are saying that the other possibilities why phosphine gas can be found could be easily ruled out, and it is most probably because of these bacteria which live in the absence of oxygen, and this gas is something that is only biologically produced. So it is produced using a biological process, and this indicates that life could have been present on Venus, and these bacteria would have produced this phosphine gas. So you have to know why phosphine gas was in news and what is the importance of phosphine gas, that it indicates the traces of life on other planets. So this is what you have to know from your prelims perspective. Next, so many other articles that were not really important. Also, there were few articles again on India China. One of these articles was by C. Raja Mohan, which is 2 theaters of peacemaking, but the content was not new, and we had already discussed that content before. And even the maritime awakening, everything is about India's and China's presence in the maritime region, in the Indian Ocean, how strong the Chinese Navy is. All of that we have already seen before. So nothing new was there in these articles. So that's it for today. Thank you.